A Viking chieftain lies dying outside the walls of an Italian city, begging for Christian baptism before his soul departs. The year is 859 CE, and after months of raiding the Mediterranean, the infamous Viking leader Hastein has supposedly seen the light of Christ. His men approach the gates of Luna with a desperate request. Their leader wants to convert and receive a proper Christian burial when he dies. The bishops and city guards debate fiercely. This could be their chance to save a pagan soul, to show Christian mercy even to their enemies. After heated discussion, they agree. If Hastein converts and dies, they'll allow his body to be brought inside for burial. 3 days later, Hastein dies. But let's back up, because the journey that brought these Vikings to this moment of deception is just as incredible as the trick itself. Hastein and Bjorn Ironside had left the Loire region of Francia in 859 with 62 ships and approximately 3,000 to 4,000 warriors. This wasn't just another raid. This was meant to be the ultimate Viking expedition, targeting the wealthy Mediterranean cities that no Norseman had ever plundered before. They first struck the Iberian Peninsula, sacking Lisbon and sailing down to the Guadalquivir River, attacking Seville. The Moorish forces there gave them their first real fight. The Vikings lost several ships to Muslim Greek fire, that terrifying medieval napalm that burned even on water. They pushed on to North Africa, raiding Mazima in the Moroccan coast, taking Blamen, what they called the darker-skinned captives who would fetch high prices in European slave markets. Some sources claim they even raided as far as Alexandria, though this might be chroniclers confusing multiple Viking expeditions. By the time they reached the Balearic Islands, and then the Italian coast, disease, battles and storms had reduced their force significantly. The Mediterranean was proving far deadlier than the familiar waters of Francia and England. The survivors needed something spectacular to make this expedition worthwhile, to return home with enough treasure to justify the massive losses. When they spotted Luna from the sea, everything changed. The city's white marble buildings, constructed from the famous Carrara marble quarries nearby, gleamed like nothing they'd seen before. The ancient Roman architecture, still impressive 400 years after the fall of the Western Empire, convinced them they'd found Rome itself. Bjorn reportedly fell to his knees, believing they'd achieved the impossible, but Luna's defenses were formidable. The city had survived the fall of Rome, Gothic invasions, and Lombard raids. Its walls, originally built by the Romans in the 2nd century BCE, stood 30 feet high in places. The harbour was protected by a chain that could be raised to prevent ships from entering. The garrison, while not huge, included professional soldiers who'd spent years fighting off Saracen pirates. The Vikings counted maybe 2,000 effective warriors left. A direct assault would shatter their remaining force. It was during this reconnaissance that Hastein developed his audacious plan. He'd noticed how the local Christians treated death and conversion with extreme reverence. Even enemies were afforded Christian burial if they converted. The bishops wielded enormous influence. If they decreed something, the military commanders usually followed. This religious authority could be their key inside. The performance began immediately. Hastein took to his bed in full view of the city walls, allowing Luna's scouts to see him weakening. His men spread word among local fishermen and traders that their leader was dying, possibly poisoned from spoiled food or struck by some Mediterranean disease. Crucially, they let it slip that Hastein had been questioning his pagan gods. Why had Thor and Odin allowed such losses? Why were his men dying so far from home? On the second day, a small delegation of Vikings approached Luna's gates under a white banner. Their spokesman, likely a Frank who joined them and spoke Latin, delivered a masterful performance. Hastein, he claimed, had witnessed a vision of the Christian god during his fever. The chieftain now understood his raids were punishment for his pagan ways. He desperately wanted baptism before death claimed him, fearing his soul would wander forever without Christian salvation. The city's bishop, whose name chronicles don't preserve, was torn. This could be a trap, but what kind of Christian would he be if he refused a dying man's conversion? The theological implications were enormous. If a Viking chieftain converted, might others follow? Could this be God working through mysterious ways to end the Viking menace? The bishop consulted with his clergy through the night. They prayed for guidance, debated scripture, and argued about their duty. Meanwhile, the garrison commander, far more suspicious, posted extra guards and prepared boiling oil. But when morning came, the bishop's spiritual authority won out. They would allow the conversion, but only a small group of Vikings could witness it. What happened next was pure theatre. Hastein was carried to the city gates on a litter, appearing barely conscious. The bishop performed the baptism himself, with Hastein weakly repeating Latin phrases, his voice supposedly fading. Some accounts claim he even took communion, though this seems unlikely given what followed. The Vikings wept convincingly. These hardened warriors who'd slaughtered hundreds, somehow producing tears for their dying leader. Then Hastein was carried back to the Viking camp, now supposedly a Christian waiting for death. The Vikings maintained their performance for another full day, with women, likely captured slaves forced to play the role, wailing in grief, and warriors sitting in silent vigil. On the morning of the third day, the announcement came. Hastein had died in the night, clutching a wooden cross his men had carved for him. The funeral procession that approached Luna's gates was elaborate beyond anything the city had seen. The Vikings had clearly prepared for this moment. The coffin was draped in stolen Christian altar cloths from previous raids. Some Vikings had shaved their beards to look more civilized and less threatening. They'd hidden their mail armor completely, wearing simple tunics that made them appear as merchants or farmers rather than warriors. The exact number in the funeral party is disputed. Arab chronicler Ibn al-Qalanisi mentions 150 Vikings, while Christian sources suggest closer to 50. What's certain is that weapons were concealed everywhere, under cloaks, inside the coffin itself, and some Vikings had even strapped knives to their legs beneath their clothing. Several Vikings posed as weeping women, their faces covered by mourning veils that also conveniently hid their masculine features. As the procession entered Luna, citizens lined the streets. Some were curious about these fearsome Northmen showing such Christian piety. Others perhaps suspected treachery but said nothing. Who would dare interrupt a Christian funeral? The bishop had ordered the church bells rung, both to honor the convert and perhaps to show God's victory over paganism. The procession moved slowly through Luna's narrow streets toward the church of San Martino. The Vikings memorized every detail, guard positions, which streets led to the gates, where the wealthy houses stood. They noted that many of the garrison soldiers had relaxed, some even removing their helmets in respect for the funeral. Fatal mistake. Inside the church, the scene was set perfectly. The coffin was placed before the altar. The bishop began the funeral mass in Latin. Frankincense filled the air. That's when the Vikings struck. Hastein didn't just emerge from the coffin, he exploded out, his sword already swinging before his feet hit the ground. The first blow supposedly split the bishop from shoulder to waist. The mourning women threw off their veils, revealing Viking warriors who immediately barred the church doors, trapping the congregation inside. Hidden weapons appeared from everywhere. The slaughter in the church was total. Clergy, nobles who'd attended the funeral, guards who'd escorted the procession. Blood pooled on the marble floors, seeping into the very stones where Christians had prayed moments before. But the church massacre was just the signal. Vikings who'd stayed outside immediately attacked the gate guards, who were completely unprepared. Some were still facing inward, watching the funeral procession. The gates were thrown open, and the main Viking force, hidden just out of sight, poured into Luna. They'd spent 3 days studying the city's layout through their negotiations, and now they struck everywhere simultaneously. The garrison commander tried to rally his men at the central plaza, forming a shield wall with the few dozen guards he could gather. But the Vikings had momentum and numbers inside the walls now. Hastein himself, still covered in funeral incense and altar wine, led the charge that shattered this last resistance. The commander died fighting, run through by multiple Viking spears. What followed was systematic plunder, with a viciousness that shocked even by Viking standards. When Hastein discovered this wasn't Rome, locals desperately explaining they were in Luna, not the Eternal City, his rage became legendary. He ordered every male of fighting age killed, not just subdued or enslaved as was typical. The women and children were rounded up for the slave markets, but the men were butchered in the streets. The Vikings spent 3 days stripping Luna of everything valuable. They took obvious treasures, gold crosses, silver chalices, coins from the merchant houses, but they also took things that showed their trading knowledge. High-quality steel tools from Luna's workshops, bolts of silk that had come from Byzantine traders, and even written documents they couldn't read but knew had value to the right buyers. They found the bishop's library and destroyed most of it, but kept illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf that could be scraped off and melted down. The marble statues were too heavy to take, so they satisfied themselves with breaking off heads and hands that held objects. One chronicle mentions they even pried semi-precious stones from a mosaic floor, spending hours on work that yielded relatively little value, perhaps pure spite at being deceived about the city's identity. The psychological impact of Luna's fall rippled across Italy like a wave. If Vikings could corrupt something as sacred as a deathbed conversion and a Christian funeral, what couldn't they violate? Churches in other cities began barring their doors to any foreign funeral procession. Some bishops issued edicts that conversions of pagans must be witnessed by multiple priests and take place over weeks, not days. The story spread through different cultures, each adding their own details. Arab traders in Sicily heard the tale and recorded it with admiration for the strategic deception, comparing it to famous tricks from Islamic military history. Byzantine chroniclers used it as an example of Latin Christian naivety. Surely Orthodox Greeks would never fall for such an obvious ruse. The Franks told it as a warning about Viking cunning, adding moral lessons about the danger of pride in showing Christian mercy. Dudo of Saint-Quentin, writing his chronicle around 1015, gave us the most detailed account, though he was writing 150 years after the events. He claims to have heard the story from Normans who descended from these very Vikings. But Dudo had his own agenda. He was writing for the Norman dukes who wanted to present their Viking ancestors as clever rather than just brutal. The coffin trick story served this purpose perfectly. Some modern historians question whether the coffin trick happened exactly as described. The Arab chronicler Ibn al-Athir places a similar story in a different location. The Chronicle of Alfonso III doesn't mention the trick at all, despite describing Viking raids in the Mediterranean. Could this be a composite story, combining multiple Viking deceits into one legendary tale? Archaeological evidence does confirm Luna was violently sacked around 860 CE. Burn layers in the old city match this time frame. Coins minted in Luna disappear from circulation patterns around this period, suggesting economic collapse. Human remains found in a mass grave near the old church show weapon trauma consistent with Viking weapons, particularly the distinctive skull damage caused by Viking axes. Whether every detail of the funeral trick is true, the strategic thinking it represents was absolutely real. Vikings regularly used deception alongside violence. They would approach cities as traders, then attack. They'd negotiate ransoms in bad faith, taking payment and attacking anyway. They understood that psychological warfare could achieve what direct assault couldn't. Hastein and Bjorn's expedition continued after Luna, though with diminishing returns. They raided Pisa and clashed with an Italian fleet near the mouth of the Arno River. Some sources claim they sailed as far as Alexandria and Greece, though this seems unlikely given their reduced numbers. They wintered in the Camargue region of southern France, where local counts paid them massive bribes to leave. The return journey became its own nightmare. Sailing back through the Straits of Gibraltar, they were attacked by a Moorish fleet seeking revenge for earlier raids. More ships were lost. By the time they reached the Loire in 862, only 20 of the original 62 ships remained. But those 20 ships were loaded with treasure and slaves that made the survivors wealthy for life. Hastein himself survived to raid for many more years, becoming one of the most successful Viking leaders of the 9th century. He later established a base in the Loire Valley and continued raiding Francia until at least 882. Some sources suggest he lived into the 890s, a remarkably old age for a Viking warrior. His name appears in French, English, and Irish chronicles, a true international terrorist of his time. The coffin trick entered Viking legend, possibly inspiring similar deceits. When the Normans, descendants of Vikings, conquered southern Italy in the 11th century, they used comparable tactics. The Norman Robert Guiscard once escaped a siege by faking his own death, though he was actually inside the coffin during his escape. Perhaps he knew Hastein's story and adapted it to his needs. Medieval priests used the Luna story in sermons about the danger of false conversion and the need for vigilance against evil. It became a parable about how the devil uses seemingly good intentions to achieve evil ends. Some versions added fantastic elements, Hastein rising from the coffin glowing with hellfire, or the murdered bishop returning as a ghost to curse the Vikings. The story even influenced medieval literature. The coffin trick appears in various forms in chivalric romances and Norse sagas. The Orkneyinga saga includes a similar deception, though with different characters. The theme of the false funeral became a standard plot device, showing up in everything from Germanic folk tales to French fabliaux. What makes the Luna deception particularly brilliant was its exploitation of Christianity's core values. The religion preached forgiveness, conversion of enemies, and mercy to the dying. These beautiful ideals became vulnerabilities in the face of Viking pragmatism. The Vikings had no cultural taboo against lying to enemies or corrupting religious rituals. These were just tactics, no different from a feigned retreat or a night attack. The immediate aftermath in Luna was devastating. With most adult males dead and others enslaved, the city struggled to function. Surrounding cities had to send food and basic supplies. The bishop's death left a spiritual vacuum that took years to fill. Many priests had been killed in the church massacre, and few wanted to serve in a city God had seemingly abandoned. Luna never fully recovered. While it continued as a minor port, it lost its status as a significant trading center. By the 11th century, it was largely abandoned, its population moving to nearby Sarzana. Today, the ruins of ancient Luna are an archaeological site, its amphitheater and forum remnants of its Roman glory. Tourists rarely visit, unaware they're walking where one of history's greatest military deceptions took place. The Vikings who participated in the raid became legends in their own communities. Runic stones in Scandinavia mention warriors who traveled south with Hastein as a mark of honor. The wealth they brought back funded new expeditions, purchased land and established dynasties. Some of that Luna gold probably ended up decorating Swedish churches, an ironic final twist to stolen Christian treasure. Modern military historians study the Luna attack as an early example of false flag operations. The principles Hastein used, exploiting enemy assumptions, maintaining deception through multiple stages, using cultural blind spots, remain relevant in contemporary warfare. Special Forces units study historical deceptions like this, understanding that physical strength means nothing if you can manipulate your enemy's decision-making. The coffin trick also raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of trust in warfare. Should the Luna bishops have been more suspicious? Were they fools for showing Christian mercy, or heroes for staying true to their values even unto death? There's no easy answer, which is perhaps why the story has endured for over a millennium. Whether every detail of Hastein's funeral deception is historically accurate or partially legendary, the story captures a fundamental truth about the Viking Age. These weren't just mindless raiders rowing from shore to shore. They were sophisticated strategists who understood psychology, exploitation of cultural differences, and the power of shock. The fake funeral at Luna remains one of history's most audacious military deceptions, a reminder that in war, nothing is sacred, not even death itself.